Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The thick, humid air of the Vietnamese jungle clung to their skin like an unwelcome second layer. The squad, 12 strong, moved cautiously through the dense foliage. Sergeant Michael Mick Carter led the group, his M16 rifle at the ready and his senses sharp. Behind him trailed Private First Class Jimmy Nguyen, their interpreter and guide, followed by a mix of seasoned soldiers and green recruits. Their mission was clear but daunting: locate an uncharted enemy base rumored to be deep in the jungle. Intelligence was sparse, the area unexplored, and the dangers unknown. "This place doesn't feel right," muttered Corporal Thompson, swiping at a mosquito on his neck. Mick glanced back. "It's just a jungle, Thompson. Keep your head straight." But even Mick couldn't ignore the oppressive atmosphere. The jungle was alive with sounds, the distant calls of unseen animals, the buzz of insects, and the occasional rustle of leaves. Yet, beneath it all, there was a silence, a stillness that set his nerves on edge. The squad moved methodically, hacking through thick vegetation, their boots sinking into the muddy ground. They passed ancient trees with roots like skeletal hands and vines that seemed to writhe as they brushed against them. Jimmy stopped abruptly, raising a hand. "Wait, what is it?" Mick asked, stepping up beside him. Jimmy pointed to the ground. There, partially buried in the mud, was a weathered boot. "Looks old," Mick muttered, kneeling down to inspect it. As he dug around the boot, he uncovered more rusted rifle, a tattered uniform, and then, chillingly, bones. "Looks like one of ours," Private Darrell Thompson whispered, his voice tight with unease. "Could be French," Jimmy said. "This area was contested long before we got here." "Great," muttered Private Harris, one of the younger recruits. "Dead guys and no backup. What's next?" "Keep moving," Mick ordered, though the discovery left a sour taste in his mouth. That night, they set up camp in a small clearing. The jungle pressed in around them, its shadows deep and unrelenting. A fire crackled at the center of the camp, casting flickering light on the soldiers' weary faces. Private Harris was on edge, his eyes darting to every movement in the darkness. "I swear something's out there," he whispered. "Relax," said Sergeant Mick, though he felt it too. Jimmy sat by the fire, his expression grim. "There's a reason no one comes here," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Mick asked, lowering his voice. Jimmy hesitated before speaking. "This jungle, it's old. Older than the war, older than the villages. They say spirits live here, ones that don't like outsiders." "Oh, come on," Corporal Thompson scoffed. "You're telling me ghosts are gonna get us?" Jimmy didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the fire. As the squad tried to rest, strange sounds echoed through the jungle. Not the usual animal calls, but something else, low murmurs, almost like whispers. Private Harris bolted upright. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Mick asked, scanning the darkness. "Voices," Harris said, his eyes wide. "Whispers, like someone's out there." "Stay calm," Mick ordered, though his hand tightened on his rifle. "It's just the wind." But, as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from all around, impossible to pinpoint. Jimmy sat up, his face pale. "It's them." "Who?" Mick asked sharply. Jimmy swallowed hard. "The spirits. They know we're here." Before anyone could respond, a blood-curdling scream tore through the jungle. The soldiers leapt to their feet, rifles aimed into the darkness. "Where did that come from?" Corporal Thompson shouted. "Could be an animal," Mick said, though he didn't believe it. But then they saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was barely visible, but its outline was unmistakable, a tall, thin figure with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. "Who's there?" Mick called out, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The squad didn't sleep that night. They huddled around the fire, their weapons ready. As dawn broke, Mick addressed the group. "We keep moving, stay sharp and stick together." The jungle seemed quieter that morning, the usual animal calls strangely absent. The squad moved forward, their unease growing with every step. Mick couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the jungle itself was alive and aware of their presence. And deep down, he knew, this was only the beginning. The second day in the jungle began with an eerie quietness. The usual buzz of insects and calls of animals were absent, leaving the squad enveloped in a silence that pressed on their nerves. Sergeant Mick Carter led the group forward, his eyes scanning the dense foliage. The soldiers followed in tense formation, their boots crunching on the damp forest floor. Private Harris, who hadn't spoken a word since the shadowy figure appeared the night before, glanced nervously over his shoulder every few steps. "You okay, Harris?" Mick asked, though he already knew the answer. I just feel like we're not alone," Harris stammered. "You're not wrong," Corporal Thompson muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. "This jungle's crawling with all kinds of things, some we can't even see." "Cut the chatter," Mick said, though even he felt the oppressive weight of the unseen. By mid-morning, they stumbled upon a clearing that appeared out of place. The grass was flattened, and several trees bore deep claw-like marks. In the center of the clearing stood a crude wooden shrine, decorated with bones, feathers, and strange carvings. "What the hell is this?" Private Darrell Thompson asked, stepping closer. Jimmy Nguyen stepped forward cautiously, his face pale. "It's a spirit shrine. Villagers build these to appease the jungle spirits. We shouldn't be here." "Appease them?" Harris echoed, his voice rising. "What happens if we don't?" Jimmy's silence was answer enough. "Let's move," Mick ordered, though his eyes lingered on the shrine. The jungle seemed to grow darker as they pressed on. Vines hung low like skeletal fingers, and the air felt heavy, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Private First Class Daniels, the squad's radio operator, tried to lighten the mood. Probably just some local superstitions, nothing to worry about. "Yeah," Harris snapped, "then explain why the jungle feels like it's watching us." "Cut it out, both of you," Mick barked. But Harris's unease was infectious. Soon, even the most hardened soldiers were glancing nervously at the shadows. That night, they camped near a slow-moving river. The soldiers set up a perimeter and took turns standing watch. Mick sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, when Jimmy approached him. "We shouldn't be here," Jimmy said quietly. "You've said that before," Mick replied without looking up. "No, I mean here," Jimmy insisted, gesturing around the camp. "This place. The villagers call it the waiting ground. They say it's where spirits gather." "Spirits don't kill men," Mick said firmly. "Bullets and bombs do." Jimmy didn't argue, but his silence was more unnerving than words. The first watch passed without incident, but during the second, Private Harris let out a strangled cry. The squad rushed to his position, finding him trembling and pointing into the darkness. "I saw something," he whispered, "a figure standing by the trees." "Calm down," Mick ordered. "What did it look like?" Harris shook his head, his breath coming in short gasps. "It was tall, thin, and its eyes they glowed." The men exchanged uneasy glances. "Could be an enemy scout," Mick said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Double the watch. No one sleeps until morning." The whispers returned that night, low and insidious. They came from all around, yet when the soldiers shone their flashlights into the trees, they found nothing. Private Daniels swore under his breath, "It's like they're in my head." The whispers grew louder, almost like laughter, and then stopped abruptly. Out of the silence came a sound that froze the blood in their veins, a child's laughter, soft and innocent, echoing through the jungle. "That's not possible," Jimmy whispered. No one lives this deep in the jungle, but then they saw it. Standing at the edge of the camp was a small figure, a child, no older than 8, with pale skin and black, empty eyes. The soldiers froze, their rifles trained on the figure. "Don't shoot," Mick ordered, his voice barely audible. The child tilted its head, as if curious, and then opened its mouth. But instead of words, a guttural, inhuman scream erupted, shaking the very air. The fire extinguished itself, plunging the camp into darkness. Panic ensued. Soldiers stumbled over each other, shouting and firing blindly into the trees. Mick barked orders, trying to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. When the fire was relit, the child was gone, but so was Private Harris. "Where's Harris?" Mick demanded, his voice hard. No one answered. The jungle was silent again, but the squad knew something was haunting them, and it wasn't finished. Morning brought no comfort. The squad's exhaustion was etched into their faces, shadows deep under their eyes. Private Harris's disappearance weighed heavily on them, but they couldn't afford to linger. Sergeant Mick Carter ordered the team to pack up and move out, though even he wasn't immune to the growing unease. "We'll find him," Mick said, trying to reassure the group. His words sounded hollow even to himself. The jungle was alive with tension. Every crack of a twig and rustle of leaves made the soldiers jump. The oppressive humidity seemed to seep into their very bones, slowing their movements. By midday, the team came across Harris's gear, a rifle and helmet lying abandoned in the undergrowth. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, just his belongings placed neatly in a way that sent shivers down their spines. Corporal Thompson picked up the helmet, turning it over in his hands. "What the hell, this?" he muttered. "Leave it," Mick ordered sharply. "We can't carry anything that might slow us down." Jimmy Nguyen knelt beside the scene, his expression grim. "This isn't random. Something's toying with us." "That's enough," Mick snapped. "We keep moving." As the day wore on, the terrain grew more treacherous. Dense vines blocked their path, and the ground became swampy, sucking at their boots. The oppressive canopy above blocked out the sun, casting everything in a dim, greenish glow. Private Daniels, the radio operator, tried to establish communication with their base, but the radio emitted only static. "It's like something's jamming the signal," he said, his voice shaking. "That's impossible," Mick said, though his clenched jaw betrayed his unease. The team stopped to rest by a cluster of ancient trees whose roots twisted into grotesque shapes. The soldiers sat in uneasy silence, their rifles always within reach. Jimmy spoke up, his voice low. "There's something about this place. The villagers. They believe these jungles belong to the dead. They say spirits of those who die here never leave." "Spare us the ghost stories," Corporal Thompson said, though his hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. Jimmy didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the shadows between the trees. That night, they set up camp again, though no one expected to sleep. They built the fire high and doubled the watch. Mick took first shift, sitting near the fire with his rifle across his lap. The jungle around them seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual symphony of insects and animals replaced by an eerie stillness. Then, the whispers began again. Low and indistinct at first, they grew louder, circling the camp. Mick strained to make out the words, but they were in no language he recognized. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The whispers stopped. A moment later, a figure emerged from the trees. It was Harris. The soldiers rushed to him, relief flooding their faces. But as they got closer, their relief turned to horror. Harris's eyes were vacant, his face pale and gaunt. His uniform was soaked, and his hands were covered in mud. He didn't respond to their questions, didn't seem to register their presence at all. "Harris, where the hell have you been?" Mick demanded, grabbing him by the shoulders. Harris's lips moved, but the words that came out weren't his. They were guttural, twisted, and unnatural, like the voice of something far older than any human. "Leave," he said, his voice layered with something otherworldly. "You do not belong here." The fire suddenly flared, casting grotesque shadows on the trees. Harris collapsed to the ground, unconscious. The squad dragged Harris to the center of the camp and laid him by the fire. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold to the touch. "What the hell is happening to him?" Daniels asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Mick admitted, "but we're not leaving him behind." Jimmy crouched beside Harris, his expression grim. "This isn't Harris anymore. The jungle has him now." "What does that mean?" Thompson demanded, his voice rising. "It means we're in deep trouble," Jimmy said. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling. The jungle was no longer just a backdrop, it was alive, watching, and closing in. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. It wasn't Harris. The soldiers froze, their weapons drawn. The scream came again, closer this time. It was high-pitched, inhuman, and filled with rage. "Defensive positions," Mick shouted, rallying his men. The fire dimmed, and the shadows around them seemed to grow taller, more solid. Shapes moved just beyond the light, too quick to be fully seen. And then, without warning, the jungle attacked. The attack began as a blur. Shadows darted from the trees, moving faster than the soldiers could track. Their campfire flared once, then dimmed as if smothered by an unseen force, plunging the clearing into flickering darkness. "Open fire," Mick bellowed, his rifle already spitting bullets into the encroaching jungle. The other soldiers followed, the muzzle flashes illuminating ghostly figures slipping through the trees, but their bullets hit nothing. The jungle came alive with movement, the undergrowth rustled, and branches above creaked under invisible weight. Then came the sound, a mix of wailing and guttural growls that sent ice through the soldiers' veins. Private Daniels screamed as a shadow lunged at him. The others turned to see him convulsing on the ground, his rifle forgotten. His body was dragged several feet toward the jungle before the squad's combined fire forced the shadow to release him. Daniels scrambled back, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "They're everywhere," he gasped, clutching at his chest. "We hold the line," Mick shouted, rallying the men. "Stay together. Don't let them separate us." Jimmy Nguyen knelt beside Harris, who still lay unconscious in the middle of the chaos. "Mick, he's burning up," Jimmy called. "Something's wrong with him." "We've got bigger problems right now," Mick snapped, his eyes scanning the shadows. Harris began to mutter in his sleep, his voice a low, guttural chant that didn't sound like English or any language the squad recognized. Jimmy backed away, his heart pounding. He's saying something, but it's not him. "Mick, it's them." The shadows pressed closer, and the firelight grew dimmer still. Private Garza, gripping his rifle tightly, started muttering prayers in Spanish. "Dios mío, proteginos," he whispered, his knuckles white. Suddenly, a figure materialized from the darkness. It stood tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the gloom, but its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. The figure pointed a long, bony finger at the squad, and an oppressive weight settled over them, crushing their breaths and sending their thoughts into chaos. "What is that?" Thompson cried, his voice cracking. "Keep firing," Mick shouted, but his rifle felt like a toy against the entity's presence. The squad's bullets did nothing to the figure, which seemed to absorb the light and energy around it. The oppressive whispers grew louder, circling the soldiers in an almost mocking chant. Private Garza broke first, dropping his weapon and fleeing into the jungle. "Garza, no," Mick called, but it was too late. The shadows swallowed him, and his scream echoed briefly before being cut off abruptly. Jimmy gritted his teeth and gripped his weapon tighter. "We need to get out of here, Mick. This isn't a fight we can win. We don't leave anyone behind," Mick barked, his voice fierce despite the tremor in his hands. The entity raised its hand, and a wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the fire completely. Darkness fell like a blanket, and the squad was plunged into chaos. Shapes darted closer now, barely visible in the moonlight filtering through the canopy. The soldiers' panicked shouts and sporadic gunfire rang out as they tried to regroup. Private Daniels let out a strangled cry as he was pulled into the shadows, his flashlight tumbling to the ground and flickering out. "Hold your ground," Mick yelled, though even he felt the crushing inevitability of the jungle's power. Jimmy grabbed Mick's arm. "We need to move. Now. Harris is our priority." "We can't fight this." Mick hesitated, his instincts warring with his sense of duty. Another scream pierced the night as one more of his men was dragged away. "All right," he relented. "Grab Harris. We're falling back to the river." Jimmy and Thompson hoisted Harris between them, his body limp but feverish to the touch. The remaining squad members formed a defensive perimeter as they retreated, their flashlights darting wildly over the oppressive jungle. The whispers grew louder as if mocking their retreat, and the shapes in the shadows followed, always just beyond reach. Occasionally, a flash of glowing eyes would appear, sending fresh waves of fear through the soldiers. As they neared the river, the jungle seemed to close in tighter. The air grew thicker, the undergrowth more tangled, as if the land itself was fighting their escape. Then they broke through the trees and reached the riverbank, the sound of rushing water a relief to their frayed nerves. "Set him down," Mick ordered, his breath coming in gasps. "We need to make a stand here." The jungle went silent again, but they all knew it wasn't over. Something was coming, and it wouldn't stop until it claimed them all. The riverbank offered no safety. The rushing water glistened under the pale moonlight, but the oppressive presence of the jungle lingered, its unseen eyes watching every move. Mick barked orders, his voice firm despite the growing fear in his chest. "Set Harris down here. We need to hold until morning." Jimmy and Thompson lowered Harris onto a flat patch of ground near the water. His fever had worsened, his skin burned to the touch, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. Jimmy wiped the sweat from Harris's brow and froze as the injured man began whispering again. The chant was louder now, almost rhythmic, in that same guttural, inhuman tongue. Mick crouched beside him, his brow furrowed. "Jimmy, what the hell is he saying?" Mick demanded. Jimmy shook his head, his voice trembling. "It's not English, it sounds like some kind of ritual." The oppressive whispers returned, blending with the sound of the river. Shadows danced on the edges of their flashlights, growing bolder with every second. Private Thompson raised his rifle, scanning the tree line. "They're out there, Mick. They're watching us." "Eyes on the jungle. No one fires unless I give the order," Mick commanded. But the jungle had other plans. A sudden splash drew everyone's attention to the river. A log or so they thought floated downstream, carried by the current. But as it drew closer, the log began to move against the flow of the water. Slowly, it lifted itself, revealing a humanoid shape. It was covered in muck and reeds, its face hidden behind a mask of dripping vegetation. Empty sockets stared at the soldiers as it rose from the water, impossibly tall and thin. Jimmy stumbled backward. "What the hell is that?" The figure raised a long, skeletal arm, pointing directly at Harris. Mick stood his ground, leveling his rifle. "Stay back," he shouted. His voice carried an edge of desperation. The figure didn't move, but the jungle seemed to respond. The trees creaked, their branches twisting as if alive. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. Harris's whispers turned into a low, guttural moan. His eyes flew open, revealing pitch-black voids where his irises should have been. "He's awake," Jimmy shouted, scrambling back. Harris sat upright, his movements stiff and unnatural. His mouth moved, but the voice that emerged wasn't his own. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the words distorted and layered as though spoken by many voices at once. The figure by the river took a step forward, and the soldiers' flashlights flickered and died. Panic swept through the group. "Fall back, to the tree line," Mick ordered, his voice strained. They grabbed their gear and hoisted Harris again, dragging him toward the dense jungle. But, as they retreated, the jungle itself seemed to resist. Vines curled around their boots, tripping them. Branches swayed as though reaching for them. Then, from the shadows, came a haunting melody, a distant, ghostly tune that sent shivers down their spines. It was a woman's voice, soft and sweet, singing a lullaby in an unknown language. Private Thompson froze, his weapon slipping from his hands. "Do you hear that? She's calling me?" "Thompson!" "No," Mick yelled, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. Thompson broke free and stumbled toward the shadows, drawn by the eerie melody. The others watched in horror as Thompson disappeared into the darkness. His scream echoed moments later, followed by a sickening silence. "Keep moving," Mick barked, though his own legs felt like lead. The remaining soldiers reached a clearing, the jungle momentarily giving way to open sky. They set Harris down again, and Mick turned to Jimmy, his face pale. "This place isn't just cursed. It's alive," Mick said. Jimmy nodded, his hands trembling, "and it wants us to stay." The lullaby started again, this time closer. The soldiers huddled together, their flashlights flickering weakly. "We don't survive this night," Jimmy whispered, his voice barely audible. Mick looked at him, determination in his eyes. "We will, we have to. At first light, we signal for the evac. We hold this position until then." But deep down, they all knew the jungle wouldn't let them leave so easily. The clearing was eerily silent, save for the heavy breathing of the remaining soldiers. The oppressive darkness pressed in, and the jungle seemed to hum with anticipation. Mick clutched his rifle tightly, scanning the perimeter. "Stay together. No one moves alone," he said, his voice steady but strained. Jimmy knelt beside Harris, whose whispers had grown louder, an unintelligible chant echoing in the night. His eyes, still black as voids, darted around as if seeing things the others couldn't. As the first faint light of dawn crept into the sky, the jungle erupted with movement. Shadows darted among the trees, too fast and too many to count. A chill swept through the clearing, and the temperature dropped sharply. Jimmy whispered, "They don't want us to leave." Mick barked, "Stay sharp. Whatever happens, we hold this position until evac arrives." The lullaby returned, soft and haunting, wrapping around the soldiers like a shroud. Jimmy dropped his weapon, covering his ears. "Make it stop," he cried. Mick grabbed him by the shoulders. "Focus, Jimmy. It's trying to break us." But then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Thompson, or at least, it looked like him. His uniform was torn, his skin pale, and his eyes glassy. He stumbled toward the group, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Thompson," Mick called out, keeping his rifle trained on him. Thompson stopped a few feet away, his head tilting unnaturally to the side. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice echoing strangely. "That's not him," Jimmy whispered, his voice trembling. Before Mick could respond, Thompson's form twisted and shifted, elongating into something monstrous. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, and its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Fire!" Mick shouted. The soldiers unleashed a barrage of bullets, but the creature moved with inhuman speed, darting between them and vanishing into the jungle. Suddenly, Harris sat bolt upright, his mouth opening in a scream that wasn't his own. The sound was deafening, a chorus of voices that made the soldiers clutch their heads in pain. Mick turned to him, desperation in his voice. "Harris, fight it." But Harris was gone. His body convulsed violently before collapsing. From his lifeless form, a shadowy figure rose, its shape amorphous and menacing. Jimmy stumbled backward, his voice barely a whisper. "What is that?" The shadow advanced, its presence suffocating. The jungle around them seemed to close in, the trees twisting and groaning. Mick shouted, "Hold your ground, evac is coming." But the men were losing hope. One by one, they were picked off by the shadows, their screams echoing in the oppressive darkness. Jimmy fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" Mick grabbed him, forcing him to his feet. "We are. We didn't come this far to die here." Just as the sun broke over the horizon, the sound of helicopter blades pierced the air. The clearing filled with light as the evac chopper descended. Mick and Jimmy dragged Harris's body toward the aircraft, their breaths ragged. Shadows lunged at them from every direction, but the sunlight seemed to weaken them, their forms retreating into the trees. They reached the chopper, collapsing inside as it lifted off the ground. Mick looked down at the jungle below, its shadows retreating into the canopy. "We made it," Jimmy whispered, his voice hollow. But as they flew away, Mick noticed something in Jimmy's lap. Harris's dog tags. He grabbed them, his hands trembling. The inscription had changed. It now read, "You'll be back." Mick clenched the tags in his fist, his mind racing. They had survived, but the jungle had marked them. It wasn't over, not yet. Back at the base, as the medics examined them, Mick stared out the window at the rising sun. The jungle still called to him, its whispers echoing in his mind. They had escaped, but the darkness had followed. And deep down, Mick knew the jungle wouldn't rest until it claimed them all. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.